So I was already asked if the SJ after my name stood for Sisters of St. Joseph. Although I wish it did, it doesn't. I'm a Jesuit, the Society of Jesus. Does everybody know what a Jesuit is? Because I'm still trying to figure it out. If you have advice, I'd love to know. Basically, the Jesuits are a religious community started in 1540 by St. Ignatius of Loyola, and I'm going to talk a little bit about St. Ignatius this evening, who was in Spain, and we have a couple Spanish Forum individuals here, so we'll be talking a little bit about St. Ignatius. But one of the things that Jesuits do is we often work in the world in addition to our ministry as maybe priests. I'm not a priest yet, but I hope to be ordained one day. But we also have Jesuits that aren't ordained. But we tend to have, sometimes work in parishes, often work in schools, but we also tend to work in a variety of other places. So that's been my benefit of coming from a background in business. That's something that I kind of see myself doing moving forward as a Jesuit as well. So this evening, I can promise you I was not picked to talk about success because of anything in my life in particular. In fact, I assume there are people in this room that know a lot more about success, and we'll be tapping into those things. But I was asked, and I'm very grateful to Sister McTild. I've known Sister McTild for a number of years, and I'm really pleased to come here. One of the first things I did when I came back to Toronto to go to theology, or to philosophy at the time, was come to a couple of Faith Connections meetings. So it's really great. It's been an important experience in my life as well, so I hope it is for you too. So, as I said, I thought I'd start with a little bit about my background. Kelly talked a bit about it, but I think it's important to kind of get some context of a person, not because by any stretch the things that I've done have been successful, but it kind of shows one person's walk, and we all have different walks, and I think culture puts a lot on us now as to what success is. I think tonight is really a chance to look at that in ourselves, but also to see the stark contrast we're seeing and what the world is telling us success is at this point. So I'll say as a caveat again, I don't believe anything that I'm going to share with you is in light of somebody's success, but just how I got to where I've gotten to. And I'm going to talk about a couple of other things following that. So I grew up in a family. I was born in Ottawa, and my dad was the youngest of 8 and highly competitive. The first in his family to go to university. He's a lawyer, he's now retired. But we had this wonderful thing at home where I grew up in a great house. Both my mom and dad are very loving, but also very competitive and very much focused on work ethic. And I remember being a young kid and talking about what work ethic is. And there's something great about that, but there's also, as most things have, kind of a shadow side. So I kind of grew up with this sense of competition, the sense of winning, and certainly that success was something that we demonstrated through action. So if you had good marks at school, that meant you were successful. If you got a great job, that meant you were not only successful, you were on a path towards even greater success. And again, I don't think any of these things are necessarily bad. In fact, they've been incredibly helpful in my life, but I think there's a balance that sometimes gets missed. So I went from university, I went to the University of Toronto and did an undergrad in physiology and virology. Virology is the study of viruses. Odd choice, but I actually quite liked it. And was very lucky because I got into, right after university, a job at quite a large pharmaceutical company, Merck & Co. And loved it. I didn't know what I wanted to do. At one point I thought I should probably go into medicine because it's something that I kind of knew what a doctor did. And I worked in a hospital, loved that experience. I didn't quite have the marks for it. So I kind of thought, well, what am I going to do next? So this was my kind of entry, keeping science, but moving into an interesting field. So I worked for Merck for a number of years. I started in sales, quickly moved into a research side of things, so I got to research vaccines. And then I worked with teams that were launching new vaccines, so I got to work with vaccinologists, experts in vaccines. So I had this really terrific life here And about 3 or 4 years into it, I moved into a position where I was in training at a large pharmaceutical company in Canada. In fact, at the time, the largest. It was terrific. And what I didn't realize was these carrots that start to get shown to you, that if you show interest, if you work hard, all of the things that I've been well taught, all of a sudden there's more carrots. And all of a sudden you start to move down a road where the next job opportunity becomes available, the next promotion. None of these were motivated necessarily for money for me, but there was certainly a motivation of proving myself. And the affirmation that comes when people look at you and go, wow, you're doing so well, you're moving so quickly through a company. And that, you don't recognize that as necessarily a bad thing, and I don't think it is. But at some point that starts to take over. And very quickly I was moving to new jobs quite regularly. Every 18 months I was pretty much into a new position, and I moved down to the States and I launched one of our big vaccines at the time, Gardasil, which you probably heard of, the HPV vaccines. So I worked on the research for that, and then I went down to the States and did the whole marketing campaign. Went really well, so then I come back to Canada, and then I'm the director of sales for Canada, and that goes well, so they moved me into Europe. And all of a sudden, time's going by, and all I'm doing, it seems, is working. I was probably working, like many of you, 60, 70, 80 hours a week. And at the same time, I'm feeling totally grateful because I've got this great job, and it seems to be moving in a great way. But at the same time, I'm realizing I have nothing in my life other than my friends at Merck, who were great people and still some of my closest friends, and my job. And yet, I was probably the envy of many people because I was absolutely what success should look like, at least to me and to others that were looking at that. So one day, I'm living in a place that is hard to describe. It was probably about a 2,000-foot apartment, right on the bank of Lake Zurich. I had moved to Europe at this point, living in Zurich, working in Lucerne. I drove a Mercedes from my home about 30 minutes through the mountains, the Alps of Zurich, to get to Lucerne, which is might be the Garden of Eden. I'm pretty sure it is, at least for people that like to snow. And I wasn't unhappy, and I want to stress that. This isn't anything about the big bad pharmaceutical world, and I had an epiphany that the marginalized were being oppressed. Probably some of that is true. I was actually really happy. But I was starting to think, there's got to be something more than this, because all I seem to do is fly, drive to the airport, fly to a new city, meet with the team there. At the time I was starting a new franchise, and I actually was responsible for a team of about 600 that was all over Europe. So I got to fly pretty much every day to the new capital of whatever country in Europe. Again, it does sound terrific, and it really was in some ways. But over the course of about 2 years there, I started to appreciate that I don't know what the end of this looks like. Eventually, you work a way up in a company, and then there's just fewer opportunities, and then all of a sudden you become kind of stagnant in some of those jobs. And eventually, and I was seeing it, a lot of people in their 40s and 50s are kind of retiring out. And then you become a consultant or you become something else. And I realized none of this part of the job, I loved the science, always had. I loved the people that I worked with, the marketing, the sales, it was all kind of interesting. But I realized none of this was actually who I was, but that success part of it was really stimulating. Except this day when I'm driving to Lucerne on my way home, and my plans changed where I was to be traveling for the next 5 or 8 days, and all of it kind of fell through. So for the first time, I'm in my apartment and have a week. Nobody was coming to visit, I wasn't going anywhere. And I just started to think, what's all this about? And it's funny how God works, because I can promise you I had pushed God's calls for many years, probably decades, about a vocation away. I hadn't thought about it a long time before then, but hadn't really thought much more about it. But in a very kind of quiet period of time when I didn't have a lot to do, everything I was supposed to do just got canceled, so I had a lot of alone time in this most beautiful place, I realized something's not right. Very quickly, I moved on, and it was one of the graces that I received. I actually entered the Jesuits from that point 6 months later, and I moved to Montreal and was in the novitiate. To the shock and horror of people at Merck thinking, how could you possibly give up this job? I have never looked back, and I have never looked back not because the Jesuits are so wonderful. There are things about the Jesuits that are great. There were wonderful things about Merck. I haven't looked back because I really miss what I did. I love traveling first class. That was a great life. Some days when I'm schlepping it on Via Rail and I'm jammed in, I'm thinking, oh, you've given up a lot. I promise you, it's nothing. But I think more than anything, I just realized and started to find out who I was. And the pressures of what success had been really didn't amount to too much as to where I was at this point. And I want to be clear, I have the same worries as I work with the Jesuits. These shadows or these demons or these evil spirits, as St. Ignatius would say, don't leave because you've left a premier pharmaceutical company. I'm still the guy doing way too many sideline projects. I'm still the guy that's biting off way more than I can chew because that comes out of a space of I like to be recognized. It's great when I've got all of these things going, not because they give me wonderful perks anymore. It's myself. And I think you need to look within yourself as to why and what is driving success. So I say that as an introduction to where I'm going this evening. We'll have time to ask questions about vaccinology if you have interest in that. So please brush up on your vaccines and we'll certainly talk about it. So what would you say are the biggest markers of success? What would the world tell you success is right now? Just some words that come to mind.
A big house.
A big house, yeah. Go ahead.
Social status.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
High salary.
High salary, for sure. Yeah.
Your position.
Position, and certainly a lot of power that comes with position. Yeah.
Driving a Benz.
Driving a Benz. Well, I wouldn't drive a Benz, but yeah, a lot of little perks like that. They all look great. And even if you don't think you're tied up into money, it's very easy for all those things to start to feel good. I think my generation had a very different sense of what success looks like. I think many of you are younger than myself. I grew up in the 80s when nobody was ever going to have a job. There was a 22% inflation rate, and the cost of a mortgage was literally thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in interest, right? Very different right now. It was also the time of Duran Duran, so there were some good things in the 80s. But we started to really see an ugly side of capitalism, and you're going to hear some of my views on things. I am a capitalist, but I think we've seen capitalism run amok, and it started not 5 years ago, not 10 years ago. It's been coming for a while, and the 80s was a big time for that. And we were all about, you need a job defines you. I think some generations after me have kind of inherited that, but I'm not sure it's so innate to this generation in terms of what the culture and the zeitgeist is pushing forward. I actually think this culture, this generation, as we're seeing with the movements happening in the States right now against gun control, I think we're seeing individuals, and you know better than me, feeling a lot of pressures of what success is, but also starting to redefine and push back on what the world is all about. One person that isn't doing that is Donald Trump. And I bring up Donald Trump not to get political in any way, but I think in some really weird ways and in some potentially very good ways, Donald Trump is shining a really strong light on success. And we can choose to agree with what is being defined as success, or we could start to look at this and go, holy cow, is that what it means to be successful? And long before Stormy Daniels, long before the latest, this week's tweets, Donald Trump was writing books, and some of my favorite titles, The Art of the Deal, which we know has been talked a lot about for the last couple of years, but two of his other big hits, Think Big, Make It Happen in Business and Life, and Trump, How to Get Rich. And I think what Donald Trump presents in these books, he's not alone. I think Donald Trump just says things that a lot of people probably feel or think or maybe disagree with, but can kind of relate to and connect. And he's challenging ideas that were presented for the last several, please, there's food, so are you just going to organize people coming up? But don't hesitate to come up. I can talk over anybody eating. And I would not want you to get in the way of food. Long before Donald Trump was talking about and writing about success, this is the idea of kind of these self-help books or success track books existed for a number of really couple hundreds of years. Going back early on in the 1800s, or early even before that, when the U.S. was first being started, Benjamin Franklin advocated virtue as the pathway for aspiring individuals who were unshackled from aristocratic tradition. In the 1800s, Horatio Alger, who popularized the rags to riches stories, many of them, he offered the perspective that hard work and character as habits would produce prosperity in a competitive market. And in the 20th century, last century, which was dominated a lot by large companies, bureaucracies that were starting to be created, Dale Carnegie, who many of us have heard about, Dale Carnegie urged individuals to cultivate human relations and an attractive personality as part of success. So Donald Trump wasn't the first to write about success by a long shot, but what he's done is kind of raise the level and the discourse around what it means to be successful. And he equates a lot of things that others see as successful. So the idea of unstinting labor, or the very, very clear work ethic, positive thinking, careful delineation of goals, mental focus on the project at hand. He's not the first to talk about these, and they are probably needed for success. But I think what Trump is doing differently, and as he talks about in Think Big, he writes, "My motto is always get even. When somebody screws you, screw them back in spades." He said many things, too, that maybe not so affronting, but the fact is, I think we're just seeing a natural evolution of what success means. If it's all about competition and all about winning, the other has to become the enemy. And where others were talking about moral virtues as a part of being what a successful person is, Trump's really pulling the Band-Aid off for what a lot of people, success is about winning. Success is being the best, whatever it takes, whether it's being virtuous or not. So again, I think there's something weird in seeing what Donald Trump is doing. Seems appalling for some, maybe not for others, but he's really changing our culture in ways that might be a good thing. It might be what we need to see, some gory details about success to kind of check back and to see what we really mean by success. I love this, so I'll add it in. According to Trump, and after he wrote that quote, he used as an example, he recounts how a real estate competitor once hoodwinked him into a complicated deal, initiated a lawsuit against him, and then offered to settle for a lifetime membership in one of his golf clubs. And Trump's reaction, he accepted the deal, but then publicly humiliated that man at every opportunity. And he wrote, "I love getting even. I get screwed all the time. I go after people, and you know what? People do not play around with me as much as they do with others." So Trump also advocates ruthless pursuing of goals, exploiting the advantage over a competitor, and maintaining flexibility in maneuvering against opponents. So if you admit defeat, well, then you are defeated. But again, I present Trump's view of things because I think they say a lot about what we're all seeing in terms of competition. Now I'm going to link back a little bit to St. Ignatius. I'm going to end a little differently, but not to talk about St. Ignatius's view of success. But has everybody heard of St. Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuits?
Yep.
So he was kind of an interesting guy. He grew up in a wealthy family. He was a wannabe soldier. He kind of was always on the sidelines of being a soldier or a nobleman. At one point, he was apparently quite attractive to the women, according to legend. I'm maybe mainly his, but he was pretty much a partier and was a playboy. He ended up in a battle where I'm not quite sure how front line he was, but he ended up getting shot in the leg with a cannonball that shattered his leg. And he ended up going through a series of kind of epiphanies in his recovery. One of them was recognizing that he felt closer to God when he would read about saints, the lives of saints. And there was this feeling of movement towards selflessness, the moving towards other, to seeing how God might be working in the world, versus a feeling when he read about noblemen and kings and queens and all the wealth and all the power. He felt actually something that was pulling him back into himself, this kind of transient feeling of glory, of success, of honor, but that didn't really fit. It didn't really stay with him. Kind of that feeling of fast food versus a good meal. So interestingly, out of that, St. Ignatius, long before he began the Jesuits, started to write what are known as the spiritual exercises, which are many of you may know of the spiritual exercises, but they're a series of not prayers like we would pray the rosary, something like that, but really tools to help us get into ultimately discernment and use imaginative prayer. So putting yourself in gospel contemplation. So you read a gospel passage and you become part of the story and find out how the others in the story, including Jesus, including others, may be communicating with you. And that becomes a big part of how you start to learn to understand how God is working in your own life. But one of the famous meditations is called the meditation of two standards. A standard is what in military world is kind of a flag or a banner under which one camp would be. So under this standard bearer or leader, this group would follow, and under another standard, another group would follow. So Ignatius presents to us this really interesting dichotomy, which seems at the surface very obvious. It's the standard of Christ or the standard of the devil, or maybe in more current terms, the devil is fine. I certainly believe in the devil, but maybe it's that evilness that happens in humanity, or that evilness in our own psychology that leads us to do things that we wouldn't necessarily want to do, but we find ourselves doing them. So this sense of good and bad. And it's in this, under these standards, we really start to look at where am I being called and what am I feeling called to? So at first it seems like an easy choice. Who wouldn't choose the standard of Christ? But the strategies that the evil spirit, as St. Ignatius would say, uses kind of tempt us into different ways. So the enemy begins by seducing us with riches. Such riches can win us honors and the esteem of others, which we can begin to have an excessive drive for that. Fixation on riches and honors devolves into a self-serving pride, leaving little room for God or anyone else. A famous Jesuit, Joseph Tetlow, wrote, and he's an expert on the exercises, wrote that it's kind of like this, that he distills the enemy's tactics into these 3 points. So the first is, look at all this stuff that I have, which leads to, look at me with all this stuff. And that finally leads to, look at me. So it's this movement towards my own glory, my own sense of accomplishment, my own pride, my own desire for more. So it's not like you're picking Jesus versus Trump. You're probably picking things that are a lot more challenging to see on the outright. So Ignatius presents these 2 standards to us and encourages us to pray and to see what are the things that are the subtle ways the Spirit is working in my life. How is the Spirit starting to pick into what I feel called to and maybe diverts that path and brings me down another place? So I think I'll spend a little bit more time on this. The strategy of Christ is very much the opposite of these 3 things that I said. So in the strategy of Christ, we embrace the countercultural value of poverty, of self-giving, and of dignified humility. The poverty of Christ is both spiritual and material. So being spiritually poor for Jesus meant that Jesus relied and encourages us to rely on the Father's love and support. Being materially poor meant that Jesus chose to live with very few possessions. We all know that Jesus liked a good party. He was the first one to be up making wine at Cana. He liked to have fun. He loved his friends. But he wasn't shackled by a whole bunch of stuff. That's the material poverty that we're talking about. And this poverty allowed him to love the other more easily and imitate Christ in this way. We're called to love others and to really love and live with dignity, with humility, and with joy. So what's really important is that material wealth is not itself an evil, and either is success in your job, or the gratitude and the thanks that people give us for doing a good job. None of these things are ever bad unless they become the motivation of what we're doing, unless they start to define who we are as people, unless they take over for God, and it becomes a really beautiful apartment in Lake Zurich and a sense of accomplishment every night you're coming home to. That's when things start to replace God in our life. And certainly where it may not start out as material wealth creeps in. And our sense of strength of character, our sense of security, our sense of self-reliance starts to tell us, I don't need a lot of other things. I'm successful on my own. And I need even a little bit of distance from people that are starting to pull me back that seem a little needy. Because I'm not that needy. I've been successful. I don't need others kind of clawing onto me. But it's in those moments we get further and further and further away from who we really are and really from God. So let's keep thinking about these two standards and let's introduce somebody different. And again, poor Donald Trump. I'm sure this is a man. I love psychology. I'm sure he's a very complicated soul, and it all goes back to a really troubled childhood where his parents probably didn't love him, and he had a far worse case of sense of need to be affirmed than I did. But let's look at Pope Francis, because I think he's the perfect epitome of what Christ is calling us under Christ's standards, and especially around success. So Pope Francis has a stark contrast to what our world and the words you use define success. If it's big house, if it's the Benz or the Mercedes or the Rolls-Royce or Jaguar, any of those are lovely cars. Or if it's the great job, even though he is Pope, it's a pretty good job. All of those things, he really pushes back and redefines success in a number of ways. I'm sure you have lots of ideas. I've kind of written about 5. The first is the valuing of simplicity. So the first thing that we saw when Pope Francis, how many remember when Pope Francis was elected? It was the most disconcerting entry onto the papal balcony ever, because he kind of walks out and then he just kind of, waves his hand. And it was like, who the hell's this guy? Like, he doesn't seem to be very popish. And one of the first things he says is, please pray for me. The next day he goes back to check out of his hotel and says he's not moving into the big papal suites. He's going to stay at the local, basically drop-in guest house. But he started to shatter what all of those trappings are about. And it's probably because he's always done that. Maybe it's because he's trying to shock us into a world that he is not the first to invent. We have many, 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 many saints, many people living in our world that live that kind of radical simplicity, wonderful examples in our lives. But he did it in a way that was shocking because normally that job creates such prestige. He kind of looked it in the face and said, I don't think any of those things are needed. And that idea of simplicity, again, I bet you, I've never met him, but I bet you the Pope loves a good party. He loves to be around people laughing. He probably loves great food and great wine. So this isn't all austere and, self-flagellating and all of these things. It's just about simplicity, enjoying life to the fullest in some ways, but recognizing we can't take it all. And he says that so beautifully in Laudato Si. Another thing that Francis did, and it came right out of the gate, was choosing the unimportant over the important. So where Donald Trump loves to talk about my rich friends, and they're the richest of friends, and they're the best friends anybody could have, and I have the best friends anybody ever had. One of the first things that Pope Francis did was hug and kiss, if you remember a photo that went viral very quickly, a very disfigured individual that was in one of his first papal gatherings. And not just, oh, here's a good photo op, a sincere you could feel an attraction to recognizing the beautiful qualities of this individual. And he described later, he could see it in his eyes. Nothing to do with who that person was, but I promise you, that was one of the most unimportant people, I'm sure, in that space. And yet the Pope purposely singled him out and raised his importance. That's so often what we don't do. It's certainly what I don't do. I love going with the set that's laughing and funny and popular, but I don't always get to realize the beauty and benefits of so many other people. And that's something that is so very much Pope Francis, and I think we're all called to. Pope Francis also really turns on his head the idea of capitalism, and I started talking about that at the start of my talk. Again, I don't think there's things wrong fundamentally, well, in all aspects of capitalism, but we're seeing rampant capitalism where we talk, and he presents so beautifully in Laudato Si, that top 1% benefiting more and more and more, and the rest, the marginalized, becoming greater and greater and greater. Pope Francis writes, behind all of the pain, the death, the destruction, in terms of capitalism feeding the wealthy, there is the stench of what Basil of Caesarea called the dung of the devil. An unfettered pursuit of money rules. The service of the common good is left behind. Once capital becomes the idol and guides people's decision, once greed for money presides over the entire social economic system, it ruins society. It condemns and enslaves men and women. It destroys human fraternity. It sets people against one another, and as we clearly see, it even puts at risk our common home. That's not from Laudato Si, that's actually from Joy of the Gospel, which was really a precursor to where Laudato Si went. But the Pope is really all about not crapping on capitalism. He pushes back on rampant capitalism for sure. But he promotes virtue in place of that. And his focus is on working and creating a just world. He writes, working for a just distribution of the fruits of the earth and human labor is not merely philanthropy. It is a moral obligation. For Christians, the responsibility is even greater. It is a commandment. And these are not hard words to understand. They're hard to live. They're exactly what Jesus did as a model for us. So this replacing of capitalism, getting back to the sharing of wealth that capitalism provides and offers, is, I think, what we're being called to. Two more ideas from Pope Francis. The idea of high status versus good character. Clearly on the side of good character. Here, the idea of many good people have become popes, many good people have become religious, priests, many good people have become politicians, but few have used their power in more humanizing manners than Pope Francis. And this is a big part of what good character means. Heraclitus said that character is destiny. By embracing this individual that I meant before, it's not just about welcoming the unimportant, it's actually showing us good character. And such displays of character makes critics treat him with a far greater respect than they otherwise would. And as in such displays of character, we are reminded that Catholics, non-Catholics, agnostics, atheists alike, that power and position aren't ends in themselves, but rather that power and position are means for displaying virtue and character. And last, the thing for me that I think typifies Pope Francis, and we really started to see with Laudato Si and his latest writings and a number of his public discourses is the idea of dialogue. In dialogue, you think, what does that mean about success? Our world, as we know, and we see it in our political systems, we certainly see it in the US, it's playing out like a horror show there. But the extreme right, the extreme left, and I'm not promoting either one's values. What I'm talking about is when we exist in the extremes and it's all about debate and there's no sense of dialogue with the other, we have no success. There is a winner and there is a loser. And for Francis, the only way to truly move forward and to truly embrace what we're being called to love God, to love the others, our companions on this earth with us, and ourselves fully, we need to dialogue. And that, to me, is what Laudato Si is all about. It's certainly about ecology. It's certainly about the right to life and many other things, but it is very much about dialogue and challenging the world that is all about debate and winning and showing that for what it is, which is a win-lose, always, whatever side you're on. Dialogue, while challenging, while we may not get everything we're looking for, more people benefit in that space. And I think that's a great gift, and I think it's going to be something that when we look back, when you guys look back in many years, when Pope Francis is long gone, it's going to be that I think helped change our church, so that we're not looking, if we tend to be more on the progressive or left side versus the right, or vice versa, we're not looking over and pointing and saying, I'm right, you're wrong. But maybe you have a lot to give, and maybe I have a lot to give, and let's try to find some middle ground. And maybe the middle ground doesn't always work, but at least it's the effort to get to that space and learn more about ourselves. I think that's what Francis is embodying most about success at this point.